My name is Brinley. I'm 29 years old. And at my father-in-law's Thanksgiving table, in front of 14 people I had spent 2 years trying to belong to, my husband's sister looked at my father's hands, his calloused, worn hands resting near his plate on their silk tablecloth, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Bless his heart." You can always tell, can't you? And the table laughed, not loudly, just that soft, private, polite laugh that people use when they want to be cruel without being accountable for it. I looked at my father. He didn't say a word. He just pulled his hands slowly off the table and placed them in his lap, out of sight, like he was trying to make them smaller. And that one small, quiet movement was the moment I decided I was completely done. Before I tell you what I did next, take a moment to subscribe to HeartPath Stories and drop your state in the comments below. Now let me take you back to where this all really started. My father spent 31 years as a licensed electrician in a small town in western Pennsylvania. Not glamorous work. Not the kind of career you mention at a dinner party and watch people's eyes light up with interest. He crawled through attic spaces in July heat and basement crawlways in January cold. He worked commercial sites, residential calls, industrial facilities, the kind of places where the work is invisible until something breaks, and then suddenly it's the only thing that matters. His hands were proof of all of it. Thick knuckles, scars worn pale, calluses layered so deep they'd lost most of their sensitivity. He was proud of those hands. He never once in my entire life apologized for them. We didn't have money growing up. We had enough for groceries, enough for school supplies, enough to keep the lights on and the house heated through the winter. Some years were easier than others. I remember one February, when my parents kept the thermostat at 61 degrees, and my father wore his old work fleece around the house like it was nothing, like it wasn't a choice he was making, so the gas bill wouldn't wipe out the buffer they'd been building all fall. He never mentioned it. My mother never mentioned it either. She worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic for 18 years, early mornings, holiday shifts when they needed covering, whatever it took. Together they made things work, and they made absolutely sure I never felt the full weight of what it cost them to do it. The thing about growing up without much is that it does one of two things to a person. It either breaks them, or it sharpens them into something harder and more precise than they might have been otherwise. For me, it was the second thing. I graduated near the top of my class, got a partial scholarship, took out loans for the rest, and paid all of them back within 5 years of graduating. I went to work for a software firm right out of school, learned everything I possibly could about how the product was built and how the business ran, and then, quietly, carefully, working nights and weekends in my apartment. I started building something of my own. What I built was a project management and permitting platform specifically designed for mid-size real estate developers. Niche, complicated to get right, and once I finally got it right, exactly what a very specific kind of client desperately needed and couldn't find anywhere else. I scaled slowly and carefully. I brought on a small team, 3 people at first, then 7. I structured the whole operation under a holding company, Clearfield Group, with a name different from my own. Not to hide, exactly. More because I'd learned early that being a 24-year-old woman without a finance pedigree meant my work would be taken more seriously if the conversation started with the product and not with me. So, that's how I set it up. By 26, the platform had 43 clients across 6 states. By 28, it had over 100. I wasn't famous. I wasn't in any magazine, but I was doing well. Genuinely, quietly, significantly well. I never told my father the real numbers. Not because I was ashamed, the opposite. I didn't tell him because I knew him. If he understood the actual scale of what I'd built, he would have worried about accepting things I paid for. He would have felt some obligation to level the score somehow, or he would have refused things going forward to avoid feeling indebted. It was easier and kinder to let him believe I had a good tech job. He'd nod and say he was proud of me, and that was exactly enough. I mention all of this because of what comes later, but also because of a conversation we had about 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had offered to buy him a new suit. My husband's family was hosting the holiday at their estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. An actual estate, with a circular driveway, a caterer, a guest list. I wanted my parents to feel comfortable when they walked in. I thought maybe if my father had something newer, something that read a little more like what those people were used to seeing, they'd be less inclined to. He stopped me before I finished the sentence. Bryn. He said it the way he always did when he needed me to actually hear him, not just listen. I have worn this suit to your college graduation, to your cousin's wedding, and to your grandmother's funeral. It is a good suit. If those people can't respect me in my own clothes, they are not going to respect me in yours. You cannot buy me into a room where I don't already belong. I didn't argue. He was right, and somewhere underneath all my hoping, I think I already knew it. I just didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. I met my husband at a technology conference in Chicago 2.5 years ago. He wasn't there for the techs. His family's firm, a real estate development company based out of Greenwich, had started exploring prop-tech investments, and someone had brought him along for the sessions. We ended up seated next to each other at a round-table lunch. He was charming in a way that felt genuine. He asked real questions about my work, the kind that showed he'd actually been listening to the previous answer rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. We talked for almost 4 hours that afternoon, missed 2 panels neither of us particularly cared about, and exchanged numbers before he had to catch his flight. The first few months were easy in the way that beginnings often are. He remembered small things I'd said weeks before. He was considerate in ways I hadn't expected from someone who had grown up with so much more than I had. When I told him about my parents, the Pennsylvania winters, my father's work, the careful way they'd made things stretch, he didn't get quiet or change the subject. He said, "That's exactly the kind of father I'd want to be." I believed him. I believed him completely. His family, though. His family was a different matter from the beginning, and I was too hopeful to read it clearly for too long. The first time I met them, we had dinner at the Greenwich house. His mother greeted me warmly, but there was something studied about it. The compliment about my dress that came a beat too quickly. The way her eyes dropped to my shoes for just a half second the moment I stepped inside. His father shook my hand briefly and asked what part of Pennsylvania I was from, and when I told him, he gave a slow nod and said, steelworking country. Not a question. Not an attempt at conversation, just a label applied and filed away. His sister was the most deliberate of all. 2 years older, married to a portfolio manager, she had a talent for asking questions designed to illuminate exactly the distance between your life and hers. "Oh, your parents still live out there? That's sweet. We've been trying to convince Mom and Dad to get somewhere warmer, but they're just so attached to Connecticut." The casual intimacy of that, we doing a great deal of work. I saw all of it. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that I was reading cold manners as hostility because I was nervous and out of my element. My husband would reassure me, now and then. "My family's just formal. They take time to warm up. Don't read into it." And I wanted to believe that so badly that I found ways to do it. We married the following spring. Small ceremony, close family and friends. My parents sat in the front row. My father cried silently, in the way of a person who almost never does, his jaw working, his eyes going bright. My mother held his hand the whole time. I looked out at them from where I was standing and thought, this is what I'm building toward. Love like that. People like them. Thanksgiving was my husband's family's largest event of the year. 14 guests, catered, formal place settings, a seating chart his mother had been working on since mid-October. When she sent it over as an actual PDF, 2 months in advance, color-coded by family branch, I noticed immediately that my parents had been placed at the far end of the table, near the corner where the table's arrangement curved away from the natural center of conversation. My husband's parents would anchor the head. My husband and I were mid-table, well within his family's orbit. My parents were at the edge. I brought it up with my husband. He said his mother had her reasons. I asked what they were. He said he'd look into it. He did not look into it. The day came. My parents drove 5.5 hours from Pennsylvania because my father doesn't fly and never has. They arrived in his 2009 Silverado, clean, maintained, completely out of place in that driveway next to the Range Rovers and the Audi Q7. My mother wore her navy dress, the one reserved for church and occasions that matter. My father wore the suit, the good one, the one with the small history sewn into every crease. They looked exactly like themselves. That was exactly the problem for certain people in that house. My mother-in-law greeted them at the door with her performance. Warm on the surface, cataloging eyes underneath. She told my mother her dress was lovely in the voice, adults use for children's artwork. My father-in-law shook my father's hand once, briefly, and pivoted immediately to someone else without completing the gesture. Inside, the house smelled of roasted herbs and expensive candles. A hired bartender worked a corner table. The dining room had been set with the kind of precision that is meant, above all else, to communicate that a significant amount of money was spent. My parents stood near the edge of the main room. My father had his hands in his pockets. My mother stayed close beside him. They were talking quietly to each other the way people do when they are trying very hard to look comfortable in a place that is work to make them feel that they are not. I stayed near them for the first 30 minutes. I made introductions. Most of the responses were adequate enough. My husband's uncle asked my father about the drive and actually listened to the answer, which I noted with disproportionate relief. But then my husband appeared at my elbow and steered me towards someone his father wanted us to meet. A developer from Westport, who was apparently the point of some future conversation. And I was pulled out of my parents' orbit for 20 minutes that became 40. When we finally sat down for dinner, the seating chart did exactly what it was designed to do. My parents were at the far end. The head of the table belonged to my in-laws. 6 full seats separated me from my father, close enough to see his face clearly, but too far to draw him naturally into any conversation happening in the center. I watched him try. He leaned toward the man beside him, one of my husband's cousins, and said something quiet. The cousin smiled briefly without looking up from his phone. My father turned the other direction, toward an aunt seated to his left, and they exchanged a few polite words before she was drawn into a louder exchange happening across the table. And then, my father was left in the specific kind of silence that happens when a person has been shown, through careful social architecture, that they are not the main event. He reached for his water glass. He took a careful sip. He set it down in exactly the spot it had come from. I know that man. I know every version of his silence. Then the main course arrived, and something shifted in the room. My father-in-law, holding court at the head of the table over a discussion about a development project in Fairfield County, made a comment that wasn't aimed at any one person. That's how those comments work. The deniability is built in from the start. He was talking about labor challenges on a current site and said, almost as an aside, the fundamental issue with tradespeople is they've never been trained to think beyond the immediate task in front of them. No offense to anyone who has taken that path. A soft, comfortable laugh from several people around him. My husband's sister, seated 4 chairs from my father, close enough that proximity was a choice, glanced at my father, then back at her husband, and said in a voice calibrated to be heard without being shouted, "Well, different worlds, aren't there?" My father heard it. I know he heard it because I watched the almost invisible adjustment in his posture. That particular straightening that happens when a person is making a conscious decision not to react, absorbing something rather than returning it. I pressed my foot against my husband's under the table. He looked at me. I held his gaze for a moment with a very specific meaning in my eyes. He gave a small nod. I thought he understood. He turned back to his food and said nothing. And then his sister reached across the table for the breadbasket. And as she did, she glanced at my father's hands resting near his plate, and she said it. The thing she said loudly enough and casually enough that it meant she wasn't afraid of consequences. Bless his heart, you can always tell, can't you? Soft laughter moved around that section of the table. I turned and looked at my father. He looked at his hands for just a moment, both of them resting on the tablecloth, and then, slowly, with the quiet and particular dignity of a man who has spent 31 years being underestimated and surviving every instance of it, he moved them off the table and placed them in his lap, out of sight. I looked at my mother. Her chin was lifted the way it goes when she is working very hard not to let something through her face. Then I looked at my husband. He was looking at his sister. There was a small, involuntary expression on his face, the micro-expression of someone who found something marginally funny and is trying to decide whether to admit it. He noticed me watching and looked away, but not quickly enough. Not before I saw it. Not before I understood completely. Everything inside me went perfectly still. I set my fork down, carefully, deliberately. I picked up my napkin, folded it, and placed it beside my plate. I pushed back my chair and I stood up. 14 heads turned toward me. I'd like to say something. My voice was completely level. I had not rehearsed what came next. There was no strategy, no plan I'd been holding. There was just clarity, the specific kind that arrives when you finally stopped hoping for something to change on its own. I looked down the length of the table at my father. My father drove 5.5 hours today to be here. He ironed that suit this morning. He has worn that suit to every important day of my life, and he wears it because he is a man who shows up exactly as himself. Without performance, without apology, without borrowing anyone's idea of what he should look like. The table was silent. Not uncomfortable yet. They thought I was making a toast. He spent 31 years doing work that most of the people in this room rely on without ever thinking about it. The wiring inside your walls, the panel boxes in your basements, the electrical systems in every building that keeps your heat running and your lights on. That is not a lesser career. It is a harder one. And it built the person who built me. I shifted my eyes to my father-in-law. You said tradespeople can't think beyond the immediate task. I held his gaze steadily. I've noticed that it's almost always people who've never done a physical task themselves, who believe that about the people who have. His expression recalibrated, not anger yet, something more careful. I turned to my husband's sister. And you? I let a moment pass. You looked at my father's hands. You made sure you had an audience before you said what you said. I want you to know I saw exactly what that was, and I want you to know that I am not pretending otherwise. She started to speak. I kept going. My father's hands look the way they do because he worked, every single day, with them, so that I could have everything I have. My voice had not risen once, it was simply true. Those hands paid for my textbooks. They kept us warm in February. I have never been more proud of anything in my life than I am of the man those hands belong to. At the far end of the table, I heard my mother make a small sound. She pressed her fingers to her lips. I turned back toward the center of the room. There is one more thing. I hadn't planned this part either, but it was there, and it was time. Your firm has been using a project management and permitting platform for the past 14 months. For your Fairfield County development and the 2 projects before it. It manages your contractor approvals, your municipal filings, your subcontractor scheduling. Your operations team has it open every working day. My father-in-law's brow came together slightly. That platform belongs to my company, which operates under a holding entity called Clearfield Group. I reached into the small pocket of my dress and placed a business card. One of the real ones, the ones I almost never carry, flat on the tablecloth in front of me. I am the majority owner and original developer. Complete silence. That's not possible, my father-in-law said. We went through a full vetting process. You vetted the LLC, registered in Delaware, routed through Clearfield. I said it simply. Not triumphantly, there was nothing to celebrate. You never asked who stood behind it. Most people don't. Beside me, my husband had gone very still. Then a phone appeared. Then 2 more. I could hear rapid searching. My husband's uncle looked up from his screen with an expression I won't forget and said, "She's right. The platform. Clearfield is listed as the parent entity. It's all in public filings." My father-in-law's face had gone a color I had never seen on him before. "We have a contract," he said. "A service agreement. 18-month term, 30-day termination clause." I met his eyes without looking away. "I'll be exercising it. You'll receive formal notice Monday morning." No one at that table moved. I looked at my husband then. He was staring at the tablecloth. He could not make himself look at me. And in that, I had my final answer to the question I had been quietly asking myself for 2 years. "I married you," I said, "because I believed you were someone who would stand up in a room full of people and tell his family that my father deserved to be treated with respect. I gave you every chance to do that tonight. I waited. You smiled." He opened his mouth. "Don't," I said. I reached down and slid the ring off my finger. It came free cleanly, without resistance, as though it had been waiting for exactly this moment. I set it on the tablecloth beside my wine glass. Then I walked the full length of that table, all 14 feet of it, past every face I had spent 2 years trying to win over, straight to where my parents sat. My mother stood the moment she saw me coming. Her eyes were full. She didn't say a word. My father looked up at me. His hands were still in his lap, out of sight. I reached down and took one of them in both of mine. His grip tightened immediately. "Let's go home, Dad." He stood without a word. He pushed his chair in carefully, because that is precisely the kind of man he is. He offered my mother his arm. She took it without hesitation. We walked through the dining room, through the foyer with its polished marble floor, through the front door that a hired attendant held open without making eye contact with any of us. My father's Silverado was where he'd left it in the driveway, parked between a Range Rover and an Audi. Still, the most honest thing on that property. I held the passenger door for my mother. She got in. I climbed into the back seat. My father came around to the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled out of that circular driveway without once glancing in the rearview mirror. We drove for a while, in silence, just the highway and the heat running and the dark coming in through the windows. Then my father said, "Your mother's going to want to stop somewhere for pie." My mother laughed, the real kind, wet and full and relieved. The kind that comes out when something has been held in too long. And I laughed too. From the back seat, in the dark, on the way home. 6 weeks later, my father-in-law's firm entered what their communications team described as a software transition period. 2 municipal filing deadlines were missed on the Fairfield project. 3 subcontractors paused their agreements while a replacement platform was being evaluated. I received 41 calls from my husband's number, 4 from an attorney I had never heard of, and 1 voicemail from my mother-in-law that I listened to once and deleted. I did not return any of them. My father called me on a Sunday in January. He said he'd been doing some thinking. He had a question. "Clearfield Group," he said. "Is that why you never wanted to talk much about work?" I told him yes. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I could hear the sound of his house settling around him. Then he said, "Bryn, why didn't you just tell me?" I said I didn't want him to feel any differently around me. He made a sound, something between a short laugh and a long exhale. I drove a 2009 pickup truck to a mansion in Connecticut. I sat at the far end of the table in a 30-year-old suit. I think I was pretty solidly already myself. He paused. "You should have told me." I had no answer to that, because he was completely right. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I was always proud of you, but you have to stop sheltering me from your own life. You understand me? I'm your father. I can handle knowing things." I told him I understood. Some things I know now that I didn't know how to believe 2 years ago. The right person does not ask you to make yourself smaller so they can fit you more easily into a life that wasn't built for you. The right family does not seat your father in the corner and find something funny in his hands. And respect is not a thing you earn by shrinking. It's something a person either extends, without conditions and without an audience, or it isn't respect at all. I wish I had understood all of it sooner. But some lessons, the ones that really take root, have to cost you something real before they stay. I walked out of that house with my parents, in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, and I did not look back. And I have not regretted it once.